I woke up that night to an eerie silence. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel comforting but unsettling, like the house was holding its breath. Jenna was asleep beside me, or so I thought. Her body was turned away, and the soft rhythm of her breathing didn't seem quite right. Something about it made my stomach churn, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the creeping paranoia I'd been trying to suppress for weeks. Jenna and I had been married for 6 years. For most of that time, we were happy. At least, I thought we were. The laughter, the shared dreams, and the little gestures that said, "I love you," had started to fade. It was gradual, subtle at first. She'd become more engrossed in her phone, more distant in conversations, and less present in our shared life. I chalked it up to stress or routine, convincing myself that we were just in a rough patch. But that night was different. A noise downstairs broke through my thoughts, a faint creak of the floorboards. My heart stopped. Our neighborhood wasn't the kind of place where you worried about intruders, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was in the house. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the dresser. The adrenaline coursed through me as I tiptoed to the bedroom door, careful not to wake Jenna. She stirred slightly but didn't turn around. I stood in the hallway, listening. The sound of footsteps came again, deliberate but cautious, moving through the kitchen. My mind raced with possibilities: a burglar, a stray animal, or something worse. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs, bat in hand. The kitchen light was off, but the glow of the refrigerator door cast long, ghostly shadows. I crept closer, ready to swing at anything that moved. That's when I saw him. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly startled by my presence. He froze mid-step, holding Jenna's favorite coffee mug as if he owned the place. "What the hell are you doing here?" I barked, raising the bat. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, his lips twisted into a smirk. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here?" The audacity of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could react, I heard another sound, soft footsteps on the stairs. I turned to see Jenna standing there, her face pale but not surprised, not confused. Instead, she looked guilty, like a kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please don't." "Don't what?" I snapped, my voice rising with every word. "Don't ask why a stranger is in my house. Don't demand answers from my own wife." Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. My world, already fragile, crumbled completely in that moment. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. If they thought this was the worst of it, they were wrong. That I stood frozen, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles ached. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, stared at me from the staircase, her lips quivering. The stranger in our kitchen didn't look afraid. He looked amused, like this was some sort of game, and I was the clueless participant. "Explain." "Now," I said, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with the effort to contain my fury. Jenna stepped forward, her hand on the banister as if she needed it to steady herself. "Jake, this isn't what you think," she stammered. "Oh, really?" I spat. "Then explain to me why he's standing in my kitchen in the middle of the night, holding your mug, like he belongs here." The man, her lover, I realized with a sickening certainty, put the mug down on the counter and raised his hands mockingly. "Relax, buddy. No need to get violent." "Buddy." He called me buddy. "Get out," I said, my voice low and sharp. "Get out or I swear." Before I could finish, Jenna stepped between us, her hands raised as if to calm a wild animal. "Jake, please. Let's talk about this. Don't make things worse." "Worse?" I shouted, the word echoing through the house. How could it possibly get worse? My wife is sneaking around behind my back, and I catch her lover in my house, and I'm the one making things worse. The man chuckled, a low, grating sound that made my blood boil. "You know, this is more your fault than hers," he said casually. "If you were giving her what she needed, she wouldn't have." I didn't let him finish. Rage took over, and I lunged at him, the bat swinging in a wide arc. He dodged, his smirk finally disappearing, replaced by a flicker of fear. Jenna screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back with more strength than I thought she had. "Stop it, Jake," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You'll go to jail." "Maybe that's better than living in this nightmare," I growled, yanking my arm free. The man had backed away, his hands still raised. All right, I'm leaving," he said, edging toward the back door. "But you're going to want to listen to her, buddy. She's got a lot to say." And just like that, he was gone, slipping into the night as if he'd never been there. The door clicked shut, and silence descended on the house. Jenna and I were alone, but the air between us felt heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. I turned to her, my chest heaving. "Start talking." She crumbled onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, I thought she might not say anything at all. But then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she began. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her words muffled. "I never planned for this, Jake. I swear." "That's a lie," I said flatly, sinking into the armchair across from her. "You don't just wake up one day and find your lover sneaking into your house. You let this happen. You invited it." She looked up at me then, her eyes red and swollen. "I was lonely," she whispered. "You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in your work. I felt invisible." My laugh was bitter. "So this is my fault now? That's the angle you're going with?" "No," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "I'm not saying that. I'm trying to explain how it started." "How it started?" I echoed, leaning forward. "Fine. Then tell me how it ends." Her silence was deafening. "You don't know, do you?" I pressed. "You've been playing with fire, and you don't even have a plan. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Or did you just not care?" She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jake. I never wanted." "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "Just stop. You don't get to play the victim here. Not after this." The weight of what had just happened settled over us, suffocating and inescapable. I wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out, but most of all, I wanted answers. And I knew I wouldn't rest until I got them. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice cold and steady. "You're going to sit in that room, and you're going to think long and hard about how to tell me the whole truth. Every detail. Because I swear, Jenna, if you lie to me again, I'll know. And there won't be a second chance." Without waiting for her response, I grabbed my phone and walked upstairs, locking myself in the guest room. My hands shook as I dialed the police, reporting a disturbance at the house. If she thought her little affair would stay our dirty secret, she was sorely mistaken. As I waited for the officers to arrive, I stared out the window at the darkened street below. I wasn't sure what I was angrier about, the betrayal or the fact that, deep down, I still loved her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I sat in the guest room, my thoughts swirling like a storm. Every sound from downstairs felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. Jenna was still in the living room, probably frozen in fear or drowning in regret. I couldn't bring myself to care. My emotions alternated between fiery anger and a cold, calculating calm. The police were on their way, and I intended to use the situation to my advantage. When the doorbell rang, I let out a long breath, steeling myself for what was about to unfold. I opened the door to two officers standing on the porch. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, spoke first. "We received a call about a disturbance. Everything all right here, sir?" I nodded grimly. "I caught an intruder in my home. He's gone now, but I want to file a report." The officer's gaze sharpened. "An intruder? Did he take anything? Did he threaten you?" "No, but I believe he was here for," my voice faltered, but I forced myself to continue. "He was here because my wife let him in. I think there's more to this situation than just trespassing." The officers exchanged a look before nodding. "We'll need to speak with her." I stepped aside to let them in, gesturing toward the living room where Jenna sat, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as the officers approached, her eyes widening in a mix of fear and shame. "Ma'am," the second officer said, his tone professional but firm, "can you tell us what happened tonight?" Jenna glanced at me, her lower lip trembling. It's complicated. It's simple, I interjected, my voice hard. A man was in our house without my consent. He left when I confronted him. Now, she can explain why he was here. The officer gave me a warning look, silently urging me to let Jenna speak. She took a shaky breath and began. His name is Eric, she admitted. He's someone I've been seeing. My fists clenched at her words, but I forced myself to stay silent. I didn't invite him tonight, she continued, her voice breaking. I told him it wasn't a good idea, but he didn't listen. He came here on his own. The officer tilted his head. And how long has this been going on? Jenna hesitated, her hands wringing in her lap. A few months. A few months? I exploded, unable to hold back any longer. You've been sneaking around for months, and you expect me to believe this wasn't planned? Jake, please, she started, but I wasn't having it. Don't Jake me, I shouted, my voice echoing through the house. You destroyed everything we built, and for what? For him? The officers stepped between us, their presence a sobering reminder of the situation. The lead officer turned to me. Sir, I understand you're upset, but let's keep this civil. We're here to de-escalate. I let out a bitter laugh. De-escalate? Sure, because this is a situation that can be fixed with a nice, calm conversation. Sir, the second officer interjected gently, would you like to file a formal complaint about the intruder? If you have any details about him, we can investigate. I hesitated, my mind racing. Filing a complaint would create a permanent record of what had happened tonight. It would be ammunition, not just against Eric, but against Jenna. Evidence of her betrayal, undeniable and indisputable. Yes, I said finally. I want to file a report. The officers nodded and began taking down the details. Jenna sat silently, her shoulders slumped and her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't try to defend herself further, didn't beg me to stop. Maybe she knew it was pointless. Or maybe she was already planning her next move. After the officers left, the house felt eerily quiet again. Jenna remained on the couch, her head in her hands. I stood in the doorway, staring at her, waiting for her to say something. Anything. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to hurt you. Stop lying, I said coldly. You wanted this. You wanted him. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. What do you want me to say, Jake? That I'm a horrible person? That I don't deserve you? Fine, I'll say it. But it doesn't change the fact that I still love you. Her words were like a slap in the face. Love? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You think this is love? Sneaking around, betraying me, humiliating me? That's your definition of love? She didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. You've made your choices, Jenna, I said finally. Now it's my turn. With that, I turned and walked away, heading back upstairs. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let this slide. She had shattered my trust, and she was going to pay for it. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd slept in a stranger's house. The bed was mine, the walls were mine, but the life inside them wasn't. Jenna had made sure of that. Her betrayal hung in the air, suffocating and inescapable. When I walked downstairs, she was already at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her together. She looked up as I entered, her face pale and drawn, but I didn't spare her a glance. I grabbed my own mug from the cupboard, poured my coffee, and sat across from her in silence. We need to talk, she said eventually, her voice soft. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch out. Finally, I looked at her. Talk then. She flinched at the coldness in my tone but pressed on. I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I want to fix this, Jake. I want us to work through it. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Work through it? You think this is something we can just patch up? Like a broken appliance? Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. No pity, no regret. Just the gnawing ache of betrayal. I'll do whatever it takes, she pleaded. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I just don't want to lose you. You should have thought about that before you let him into our bed. I shot back, my voice sharp. Before you turned this house into a joke? Her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Once, I might have reached out to comfort her. Once, I might have believed her tears meant something. But not anymore. Here's the deal, I said, leaning forward. You stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours. You want to save this marriage? Fine. But I'm not the one who's going to do the work. You are. She nodded quickly, desperate. I'll do it. I promise. Good, I said, standing up. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. What do you mean? I didn't answer. I left the room, grabbing my keys on the way out. She didn't need to know what I meant, not yet. That day, I started putting my plan into motion. If Jenna thought she could manipulate me into forgiving her, she was wrong. This wasn't about saving the marriage anymore. It was about regaining control, about making sure she never forgot the consequences of her choices. First, I gathered evidence. The police report from the night before was a start, but it wasn't enough. I accessed our shared phone account and pulled her call and text records. There he was, Eric. Dozens of calls, countless messages. It made my stomach churn, but I pressed on, taking screenshots and saving them to a private folder. Next, I installed a small camera in the living room, hidden in plain sight among the decorations. If she brought him here again, I'd have proof. Cold, undeniable proof. It felt invasive, even cruel, but then I reminded myself, she was the one who had crossed the line first. Finally, I made a call to an old friend, Matt, who worked in private security. I didn't give him all the details, just enough to let him know I needed help tracking someone. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. By the end of the day, I had Eric's address, his workplace, and enough dirt on him to ruin his life if I wanted to. That night, Jenna tried to talk to me again. She sat beside me on the couch, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. I pulled away. Don't, I said coldly. You don't get to touch me. Her face crumpled, but I turned my attention back to the TV, ignoring her. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. Not as sorry as you're going to be, I muttered under my breath, so low she couldn't hear. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following days were a blur of planning and waiting. I kept my distance from Jenna, letting her stew in her guilt and uncertainty. I made sure she had no idea what I was up to, no inkling of the storm that was about to descend. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Matt. Got what you need. Call me when you're ready. I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart pounding. This was it. The next step. The turning point. I wasn't sure if I was ready to cross the line I was about to step over, but then I thought of Jenna's betrayal, of Eric's smug face in my kitchen, and I knew I was ready. The days dragged on as I carefully laid the groundwork for what I knew had to happen. Every moment felt heavy with anticipation, every glance at Jenna a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered our lives. She moved around the house like a ghost, trying to act normal but failing miserably. I could tell the weight of her guilt was consuming her, but I didn't care. She deserved it. That night, I called Matt. Send me everything, I said, my voice steady. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a series of emails. Photos of Eric at his workplace, screenshots of his online activity, and, most damning of all, evidence that Jenna wasn't the only married woman he'd been involved with. He was a serial predator, exploiting women in unhappy relationships and wrecking homes without a second thought. The anger that had been simmering inside me boiled over. This wasn't just about Jenna anymore. It was about him. He had walked into my house, into my life, and treated me like a fool. That was his first mistake. His last mistake would be underestimating how far I was willing to go to make him pay. The next morning, I sat across from Jenna at the breakfast table. She looked at me warily, as if she could sense that something had shifted. I met her gaze and spoke calmly. Call him. Her fork clattered onto her plate. What? You heard me, I said. Call him. Invite him over. Tell him you're alone. Her eyes widened in horror. Jake? No. I can't. You don't have a choice, I interrupted, my tone ice cold. You owe me this much. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed. I listened as she spoke softly, arranging for Eric to come by later that evening. When she hung up, she looked at me, her expression pleading. What are you going to do? You'll see, I replied, standing up and leaving the room. By the time Eric arrived, I was ready. I watched from the shadows as he parked his car in front of the house, his confident swagger making my blood boil. Jenna opened the door, her face pale, and let him in without a word. Hey, babe, he said, leaning in to kiss her. She turned her face away, and his smirk faltered. What's wrong? Me, I said, stepping out of the shadows. Eric spun around, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of me. What the hell is this? He demanded. This, I said, holding up my phone, is your reckoning. I tapped the screen, and a video began to play. It was a compilation of his conversations with Jenna, taken from her phone. Every flirtatious comment, every plan they had made to meet, every degrading word he had used to describe me, it was all there. Eric's face paled. You have no right. Oh, I have every right. I cut him off. You walked into my house, into my marriage, and thought there wouldn't be consequences? Think again. Jenna stood frozen, her eyes darting between us. Jake, please. Stay out of this, I snapped. You've done enough. Eric tried to regain his composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. What do you want? He asked. I want you out of my life, I said. Out of her life. And I want you to understand what happens when you mess with someone's family. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of the evidence Matt had gathered, photos of Eric with other women, screenshots of his online accounts, even a record of complaints filed against him at work. This, I said, holding up the folder, is going to every person you've ever lied to. Your boss, your wife, every woman you've ever conned into thinking you cared about them. Eric's confidence crumbled. You wouldn't. Try me, I said, my voice steady. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then Eric turned to Jenna, his voice desperate. You're not going to let him do this, are you? She didn't respond. Her silence was answer enough. You've got 5 minutes to get out of my house, I said. And don't think about coming back. Because if you do, I'll make sure you regret it. Eric hesitated, his gaze shifting between me and Jenna. Finally, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I watched from the window as he got into his car and sped away, the taillights disappearing into the night. When I turned back to Jenna, she was sitting on the couch, her head in her hands. It's over, she whispered. He's gone. No, I said, my voice hard. This isn't over. Not even close. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. What do you mean? You destroyed my trust, Jenna, I said. And trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight. If you want this marriage to survive, you're going to have to prove you're worth it. And that's going to take a hell of a lot more than tears and apologies. She nodded slowly, her face crumpling with the weight of her guilt. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. We'll see, I replied, turning and walking away. Because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The silence in the house after Eric's departure was deafening. Jenna stayed on the couch, her head bowed and her hands clutching at her lap. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Not yet. The storm inside me hadn't subsided. It had merely shifted, waiting for the next surge. I retreated upstairs to the guest room, needing space to think. The weight of everything I had done, and everything I still intended to do, pressed down on me. My phone buzzed with a text from Matt. How'd it go? I stared at the message for a moment before replying. He's out of the picture. Thanks for your help. Matt's response was swift. Anytime. Let me know if you need anything else. I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the events of the night replaying in my mind. There was a grim satisfaction in watching Eric's smug confidence crumble, but it wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough until I felt like I had control of my life again. The next morning, I found Jenna in the kitchen, sipping a mug of coffee. She looked exhausted, as if the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. Good. I wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. We need to set some ground rules, I said, my voice firm. She looked up at me, her eyes wary but resigned. Okay. First, no more secrets. I want access to everything, your phone, your email, your social media. If you're serious about fixing this, you'll have nothing to hide. She nodded, swallowing hard. Okay. Second, you're going to therapy, I continued. Both of us are. Together and separately. You need to figure out why you did this, and I need to figure out if I can ever forgive you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. I'll do it, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. And third, I said, my voice hardening, you're going to cut off every connection to him. No messages, no calls, no chance encounters. If I find out you've been in contact with him, even once, we're done. She nodded again, her tears spilling over. I understand. Good, I said, grabbing my coffee and heading for the door. Because this is your one chance to prove you're worth staying with. Later that day, I began taking steps to protect myself. I met with a divorce lawyer, laying out the situation and gathering information about my options. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Christine, listened intently as I explained everything. You've done well to document everything, she said, flipping through the file I handed her. If it comes to divorce, you'll have a strong case. Adultery is still taken seriously in court, especially with this level of evidence. I'm not ready for that yet, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. But I need to be prepared. Christine nodded. Understandable. I'll keep this on file. And if you need to move forward, just let me know. I left her office feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The safety net was in place, but it felt like admitting defeat. I wasn't sure if our marriage was salvageable, but I owed it to myself to try, if only to say that I had. That evening, Jenna approached me cautiously, her hands trembling as she handed over her phone. You can look through it, she said softly. I have nothing to hide. I took the phone without a word, scrolling through her messages, emails, and social media. True to her word, there was no trace of Eric. Either she had deleted everything, or she had already started cutting ties. I wasn't sure which, but for now, it would have to be enough. I've made an appointment with a therapist, she said. For both of us. I nodded, handing her phone back. Good. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. Jake, I know I've said it before, but I need you to know. I'm sorry. For everything. For lying. For hurting you. I hate what I've done. I met her gaze, searching for sincerity. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. Only time would tell. I hear you, I said finally. But words aren't enough anymore, Jenna. You're going to have to prove it. I will, she said, her voice breaking. I promise I will. As she walked away, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tenuous thing. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but maybe, just maybe, I could start to believe that it was possible. But as I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, staring at the faint outline of where Eric's mug had been on the counter, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about Jenna. It was about me. About finding a way to rebuild the pieces of my shattered trust and deciding whether she would be a part of that new life, or just a painful memory. The following week passed like a test neither of us was prepared for. Every moment felt fragile, every interaction tinged with unspoken questions. Jenna moved cautiously, as though one wrong step might shatter the tenuous peace we'd managed to establish. I watched her constantly, waiting for signs of betrayal or insincerity. She said all the right things, did everything I asked, but trust wasn't something she could rebuild with gestures or words alone. The first therapy session was tense. We sat in a small office with neutral-colored walls, the air heavy with discomfort. Dr. Rayner, a soft-spoken woman with an empathetic smile, introduced herself and laid out the ground rules. This space is for honesty, she said. You'll both need to share openly, even when it's difficult. That's the only way we can make progress. Jenna nodded quickly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, unwilling to give away how uneasy I felt. I hadn't wanted to come, but if Jenna was serious about earning back my trust, I needed to see her try. Why don't we start with you, Jenna? Dr. Rayner suggested. Tell me why you're here. Jenna glanced at me before answering, her voice trembling. I'm here because I hurt my husband. I broke his trust. I betrayed him in the worst way possible, and I want to fix it, if I can. And you, Jake? Dr. Rayner asked, turning to me. Why are you here? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I'm here because I need answers. I need to understand why she did it. And I need to figure out if I can ever forgive her. The session unfolded slowly, painfully. Jenna recounted the affair in halting sentences, tears streaming down her face as she admitted how it had started, how it had spiraled out of control. I listened in silence, my jaw clenched, trying to hold back the flood of emotions her words triggered. I felt invisible, she said, her voice breaking, like I didn't matter anymore. And Eric, he made me feel seen. Her confession cut deep, but I forced myself to speak. And what about me? What about our marriage? Did that mean nothing to you? It meant everything, she said, looking at me with tear-filled eyes. That's why it hurts so much now. I never stopped loving you, Jake. I lost sight of what we had. Dr. Rayner intervened gently. It's clear that there's a lot of pain here, but there's also a lot of history, a foundation that might be worth rebuilding. The question is, are you both willing to put in the work? Jenna nodded without hesitation. I hesitated, my mind racing with doubts. Could I really do this? Could I let go of the anger and the hurt and try to move forward? I didn't know. But for now, I nodded. The days that followed were an uneasy truce. Jenna threw herself into therapy, attending individual sessions, and showing me the notes she had taken. She deleted Eric's number, blocked him on every platform, and even changed her routine to avoid places where they might cross paths. She was trying, that much was clear. But the walls I had built around myself were high and unyielding. Every time she reached out to touch me, every time she said, I love you, I felt a pang of resentment. Her words felt hollow, tainted by the memory of her betrayal. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, she broke the silence. Jake, she said softly, I know you don't believe me yet, but I need you to know, I'm not giving up on us. I looked at her, my fork suspended midair. And why should I believe you? Why should I trust anything you say? She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. Because I'm still here. Because I'm trying. And because I love you. I set my fork down and leaned back in my chair, studying her. Love isn't enough, Jenna. Not anymore. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove myself to you. I need you to give me a chance. The vulnerability in her voice stirred something in me, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't let myself be swayed by emotions, not yet. She had to earn my trust, one painstaking step at a time. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, I replayed her words in my mind. Could I ever believe her again? Could I let go of the anger that burned inside me, the constant reminder of what she had done? I didn't know. But as the minutes turned into hours and the house fell silent around me, one thought lingered. If there was even a chance of rebuilding what we had, wasn't it worth trying? The question haunted me as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, the answer just out of reach. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of our lives shifted into something resembling normalcy, at least on the surface. Jenna continued attending therapy, throwing herself into every exercise and assignment with a desperation that was hard to ignore. She apologized endlessly, but no matter how hard she tried, the chasm between us remained. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, flipping through the evidence Matt had sent me. Photos of Eric laughing with other women, text logs that made my stomach churn. It was all there, a stark reminder of the man who had invaded my life. But amidst the anger, a new thought began to take shape. Eric wasn't just a part of Jenna's betrayal. He was a predator who made a game out of destroying families. My focus shifted. This wasn't just about repairing my marriage anymore. It was about justice. I reached out to Matt again, asking him to dig deeper into Eric's life. It didn't take long to uncover the cracks in his facade. His charm masked a history of failed relationships, angry confrontations, and even a handful of restraining orders. He'd been careful, always staying just within the bounds of legality, but there were patterns I could use. Meanwhile, I maintained the act of trying to rebuild things with Jenna. I wasn't sure if it was real or part of my growing plan, but I kept going to therapy, kept playing the role of the cautious, wounded husband. Jenna seemed genuinely remorseful, but her guilt wasn't enough to erase the scars she'd left on my heart. One evening, Matt called with the information I'd been waiting for. Eric had a habit of gambling at a seedy poker club downtown. He owed money to a few dangerous people and had been dodging payment for months. It was the leverage I needed. I made a few calls, posing as one of the debt collectors Eric was avoiding. I left a message on his voicemail, using a distorted voice to demand repayment. "We know where you are, Eric," I said, "and we know what you've done." The bait was set. Eric took the bait almost immediately. He called back, his voice shaking as he begged for more time. "I'll pay," he stammered. "Just give me a few days." "Too late for that," I replied coldly. "You've made too many enemies, Eric. Now you're going to have to pay in other ways." The fear in his voice was palpable. "What do you want?" "Meet me," I said, giving him the address of a deserted parking lot on the edge of town. "And don't even think about running. We're watching." Eric arrived at the parking lot just after midnight, his face pale and his movements jittery. I watched from the shadows, letting him stew in his fear before stepping out. His eyes widened when he saw me. "You," he said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and panic. "What the hell is this?" "This," I said, holding up a folder filled with incriminating evidence, "is your life unraveling." Eric tried to play it off, but the facade cracked under the weight of what I had. I didn't threaten him with violence. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. I laid out my terms: disappear from Jenna's life, confess his actions to every woman he deceived, and leave town. If he didn't, I promised to expose him to everyone he had wronged. "You don't have a choice," I said. "This ends now." Eric's departure was swift. Within days, he quit his job, packed up his belongings, and left town. I didn't care where he went, as long as it wasn't here. The weight of his presence lifted, but it didn't erase the damage he'd done, or the damage Jenna had caused. Jenna, for her part, seemed relieved. "I can finally breathe," she said one evening, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Jake, for giving me a chance." I didn't respond. Her gratitude felt misplaced. I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing it for me. The weeks that followed were filled with tentative steps toward rebuilding. Therapy sessions became less about pain and more about hope. Jenna began volunteering at a local shelter, trying to channel her guilt into something meaningful. I started focusing on my own healing, rediscovering hobbies I had abandoned and reconnecting with old friends. We weren't the same people we had been before the affair, and maybe that was a good thing. The cracks in our marriage were still visible, but slowly, we began filling them with something new, something stronger. Months later, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Jenna reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked. I looked at her, searching for the answer in my heart. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we're on our way." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even closure. But it was something. And for now, that was enough.